And now I want to talk to you a little bit about, mostly I'm going to talk about the first rule in 12 Rules for Life, because there's a problem that I want to address tonight. And that problem is, it's the problem of the left. But I'm not approaching it precisely as a critic of the left any more than I would be a critic of the right. I want to approach the problem of the left as if it's a technical problem, because I do think it's a technical problem. And I want to lay out why it's a technical problem. So a little bit of background for this. And I'm going to do that in the context provided by the first rule, which is stand up straight with your shoulders back, which is a meditation, at least in part, on hierarchies and their permanence, and the strategy that you need to implement if you're going to be successful in the permanent hierarchy. Now, in 12 Rules for Life, in the first chapter, I talk about hierarchies, and there's a reason for that, and the reason is, at least in part, to address, what would you call it, a profound, but also very attractive criticism of the West, its capitalist structure, its private property structure, its individualism, leveled by the radical leftists, most particularly the Marxists. Now, the Marxist types, with a little help from the postmodern types, tend to conceptualize the West as a patriarchy and as an oppressive patriarchy. And to lay and that's a hierarchical structure, the patriarchy, with in principle a few people dominating the top of it. And to also lay the fact of that hierarchy and its unequal distributions at the feet of Western civilization and capitalism. And so it's partly what I'm trying to address in the first rule. It's like, okay, let's take a look at that. And what I was attempting to put forward was a proposition, which is, the problem is way deeper than that. Like, we could give the devil his due and say that those who criticize the structure of hierarchies for their tendency to tilt towards domination by power and their proclivity to dispossess people, to make people stack up at the bottom, that's all accurate. But it's even more accurate than the Marxist types presume, because they make the presumption that that's a consequence of the political system and the economic system and the social system and so forth that exists particularly in the West. But that's not the case, because hierarchical structures that dispossess, that are rigid and dispossess, have been around for 350 million years. And so I traced them back to crustaceans, lobsters, somewhat famously now. Now I'm being pursued by lobsters everywhere I go. People give me lobster oven mitts and our lobster salt and pepper shakers, and Jesus, I've got more lobsters than you can shake a stick at, which isn't something I ever really planned, but it serves me right. But the point that I was trying to make was, well, first of all, that hierarchies are the most common method for solving the problem of cooperation and competition in relationship to scarce resources by living creatures, period. Not capitalists, not Westerners, not human beings, not even mammals, right? Not even reptiles. Glorified insects have hierarchies. And hierarchies have been around for so long that the most fundamental neurological structures of our nervous system, the ones that run on serotonin, and serotonin is the neurochemical that actually sets up your nervous system and kind of organizes its functions like a conductor organizes an orchestra. Hierarchies have been around for so long that the primary phenomenon to which your nervous system has adapted is in fact the hierarchy. And that's the 350 million year problem. So if we're going to talk about hierarchies and their problems, and we should, we'll get to that in a minute, we're not going to lay the damn problems at the feet of the West or capitalism or even human beings. We're going to look way deeper than that. Okay, so, right, and so let's say that you tilt towards the Marxist end of things, and you actually care about the dispossessed. Not that you actually necessarily genuinely care about the dispossessed if you're a Marxist, but you might be using that as a nice cover story, and a little bit of it might be true. But let's give the devil his due and say that, well, some people and some parts of each person actually do care about the dispossessed, the poor, the struggling, and all of that in a genuine manner. And so then the first thing I would say is, well, if you actually do care about the dispossessed, then you should bloody well take the problem a lot more seriously than the Marxists do. And that's partly what I was trying to do in chapter 1. It's a way worse problem than you think. Okay, let's run through a couple of propositions. Proposition number 1. You actually have to do something in the world. You have to act. And the reason for that is that you'll die if you don't. You'll suffer, and then you'll disappear. You can't just sit there and live. For a little while you can, because there you are sitting there and you're alive and all of that, but it's not something you can do for a very long period of time. You can't do it physiologically, and you can't even do it psychologically. Like, most people are very, very miserable if they're not actively engaged in something on a pretty regular basis. So it's like the demand for action is built into you. And it's been built into you ever since single cells started to move actively in the world. That's a very, very long time. So approach and avoidance, so that's movement towards and movement away from things, are that's the most fundamental, apart from the ability to reproduce, it's like the most fundamental element of active life. It's a very old issue that you have to act in the world. All right, in order to act in the world, which you have to do in order to survive, then you have to value things. So, what things? Well, a small number of things. Because part of what you're doing when you're acting in the world, or even looking at the world, which is actually a form of action, by the way, because when you look at the world, it isn't like you're passive. It isn't like your eyes are just taking in what's there. Your eyes are moving around like mad, constantly. They have little tiny movements called saccades, and if they stop, then you go blind right away. Your eye is moving constantly, and then there's larger movements because your eyes dart around all the time. And so I'm telling you that because it shows that perception is dependent on action. And then not only that, you have to focus your attention on something rather than everything. So like when I'm talking to the audience, I don't just sort of glance blindly at everything. I'm focusing very intently on a single person, and not even on the person, but on their face. And not even on their face, but on their eyes. Like our focus is unbelievably intense and narrow. And so you have to act even to perceive. And to perceive and act, you have to select. And the way you select is by ignoring almost everything and privileging something. And so and to ignore everything and to privilege something is to value, right? Because what you're doing just by looking at something is acting out the proposition that one thing is more important than everything else. So there's no perception or action without a hierarchy. Period. You can't even see the world without a value hierarchy. So that's a really cool thing to know. Sorry about that. And then, so a hierarchy is inevitable because you can't even see without one, let alone act. You know, and if your hierarchy isn't quite pointed so that you can figure out what the point of things is, then you're just confused. It's like it isn't even though you can reduce the world to 2 or 3 things that you value, because that doesn't work out. If you wake up in the morning and you don't know which of 2 or 3 things to do, what you end up doing is nothing, right? Because you're tortured by the conflict between the 2 or 3 things, even though there's maybe like 50,000 things you can do, even way more than that. Reducing them to 2 or 3 doesn't do the trick. You have to reduce what you're going to do to one thing, which you privilege above everything else. Perception and action are dependent on a value hierarchy. Well, there's no getting rid of the damn hierarchy. Okay, next thing. Let's say that you do decide that you're going to do something, and you start to act, but then it turns out that you're going to act in the world, in the social world, because you're not alone, ever, not really. maybe for brief periods of time, maybe if you live way the hell out in the bush, but you don't, and very few people do, and even the people who do often have something that's not so right about them, and they tend to go off the rails very rapidly, because we don't do well as individuals, purely isolated. You outsource your sanity. You surround yourself by people to whom you make yourself vaguely acceptable, and then they slap you a little bit all the time to keep you in line. And that's how you stay sane. It's not like you got all that organized by yourself. You certainly don't. And so, you know that because you have your family around you, and although they probably drive you crazy, they also keep you on the straight and narrow to a quite a remarkable degree. And your friends do the same thing, and your employers and so forth. So, anyways, when you're out in the world and you decided to act, you have to act in a context that's composed of all these other people. And so how do you do that? Well, generally what you do is you make a hierarchy. That's what you do at work. There's a hierarchical structure. That's what you do in the government. That's what you do that's even what you do in friendships to some degree. You even do that in bars. There's a hierarchy in a bar. Everyone knows that. So especially if it's a bar where people are striving to meet each other, there are people who are very successful at that and people who aren't. You organize your cooperation and competition in relationship to a valued goal into a hierarchy. And you have to, because otherwise you cannot organize what you do socially. So you can't see the world and you can't act without a hierarchy. And then you can't act in the world without producing a social hierarchy. And that's why even lobsters have hierarchies, and chickens. I wrote about them a little bit in the first chapter of 12 Rules for Life too. Chickens have a pecking order. So when the farmer comes out to feed the chickens, it's the celebrity chickens that get to eat first. And the hangers-on, they're at the back, and they get the leftover grain, and the price they pay for moving ahead in the hierarchy is that they get pecked a lot, maybe to death. And so the less successful chickens accept waiting for food as a viable alternative to being pecked to death. And that's exactly what we do with our hierarchies, is that instead of having a fight about who gets access to what all the time and risking the fight, and the fights are very, very unpleasant, we formulate a hierarchy, and then everyone is positioned, and then we all know whose turn it is when. And then if we're smart, we don't base the hierarchy on power. This is another problem with the radical leftist view of the world, because we don't care that much about power, except when things deteriorate, and power doesn't solve problems. So, for example, there is a hierarchy of plumbers, and if you go into any town, some of the plumbers are doing very well, and those are usually the plumbers whose pipes don't leak, and who get a reputation for being able to do the job properly, and maybe they're also good business people, and maybe they have a marketing flair, and maybe they're good at self-promotion, who the hell knows, but at the basis of it, at least, especially with something like plumbing, is they know how to put pipes together that don't leak. And it turns out that we actually want pipes that don't leak because nobody wants a house full of sewage, and so you actually try to find the competent plumber, and you peel from the top of the dominance hierarchy. And so if we're smart, we make our hierarchies based on competence. And competence would be the ability to pursue something of value, but even more importantly, to pursue something of value that everyone values. Not just you, it has to be something that other people want too. And so it's okay that there's a hierarchy, because what you want, if you're trying to solve a problem that everybody wants to solve, is to produce a structure where the people who are the best at solving it get to solve it. Otherwise, you don't solve the problem. So you need the damn hierarchy. So let's stop complaining about them. Let's stop assuming they're secondary consequences of the Western capitalist patriarchy, because they're not. Now, that's a right-wing position, fundamentally, because one of the things that characterizes the right wing is comfort with and respect for hierarchies. And so there's a place for the right because we need the damn hierarchies, and we should have some respect for them and some gratitude for them, because we can't organize our perception without them, and we can't act towards valued ends in the world without them. But, and this is why the left is necessary, just because hierarchies are necessary, and just because they've always existed, essentially, doesn't mean they're without their problems. And they have intrinsic problems. And this is part of the postmodern criticism of hierarchies. When you privilege something above everything else so that you can see it or act towards it, you dispossess everything else. You make it of lower status. Now that's okay when you're looking at the world, because you can't look at everything at once. It's an impossibility not to ignore and dispossess most of everything. But if it's an economic situation, it gets kind of brutal. So we set up hierarchies, even if they're hierarchies of competence. First of all, a hierarchy of competence can degenerate, which it does. Like the mafia is not precisely a hierarchy of competence. It's a hierarchy of power. And so as a hierarchy of competence deteriorates, it can transform into a hierarchy of power. And that means that people who aren't necessarily competent come to dominate it and to extract resources from it. And that's how hierarchies degenerate. And they do degenerate. And part of what the left says is, yeah, you claim that your hierarchy is one of competence, but I can see it becoming corrupted by nothing but power. It's like, yes, that's a valid criticism. We've known even the ancient Egyptians had a god of hierarchy. That was Osiris. I wrote about that a little bit in 12 Rules for Life, but more in my book, Maps of Meaning. And they also had a god of the degeneration of hierarchies. And that god was named Set. And Set was, Set as a name, Set was the name that becomes Satan as the Christian revolution emerged out of its Egyptian and Greek background. And so we've known forever, at least in dramatic form, that hierarchies of competence can degenerate into hierarchies of power, and that's bad news, and that part of what we need to do is to be awake and be careful and to adjust our hierarchies to make sure that they stay functioning as the useful tools they're properly designed to be. And then the other thing that the left says is, well, what if you can't function in the hierarchy, even if it's a hierarchy of competence? Now, this is a very complicated problem, and this is why I wanted to address this as a technical issue. I mean, the first issue is, there's going to be some time in your life when you're not very good at maneuvering in the hierarchy, even if you're competent, right? Because you're going to be sick, or someone close to you is going to be sick, and that's going to take you out too. If you have a really close family member, like a child, and they're ill, it's like you're compromised in a serious way, directly proportionate to their illness, or maybe you have to take care of a sick parent. And so there's going to be some time in your life where you're part of the dispossessed. And that's going to be true for everyone. And so we probably need to do something about that, because it's a situation we're all going to find ourselves in at one point or another. And then also, there's the problem of the people who are more permanently dispossessed. So here's a really vicious problem that no one will talk about, that everyone needs to talk about. So imagine you have this hierarchy, and you have this hierarchy, and you have this hierarchy. So you have a whole set of hierarchies, because our society isn't a hierarchy, it's a whole set of hierarchies. And they're sort of loosely aggregated into a meta-hierarchy, because there's recognized power structures across all those sets of hierarchies. Wealth might be one, and political power might be another. Then you think, well, it's good that we have all those hierarchies, because if you're not good at one thing, maybe you can be good at another. And so you're dispossessed because you don't know how to sing, but maybe you're a pretty good engineer, and so you don't have to sing. And hopefully in a pluralistic society, we can set up a lot of different hierarchies, and everyone can find one in which they're a contender. Even if you're not at the top, that might not even matter. What you really want is some hope that you can move towards the top, right? That's even better than being at the top, I think, most of the time, because people live more on hope than actuality anyways. And you need a vision for the future and something to work toward. And so if you found a hierarchy where your particular competence might express itself properly, then you have something to live for. And hopefully we could provide that for everyone. And in a diverse society, a properly diverse society, to use a word I really despise because of the way it's being used, you might set up enough hierarchy so that everybody would have a chance to move toward the top. And I think in the West we've done a remarkable job of that, because most people can find their place. But here's a problem. So intelligence is a problem, Because one of the things that predicts your ability to be successful in any hierarchy, virtually any hierarchy, is how intelligent you are. And you can assess that with IQ tests quite accurately, by the way, despite the fact that people don't like that idea, and no wonder they don't like it. And so what that means is that if you happen to be born at the lower end of the cognitive distribution, through no fault of your own, the probability that you're going to end up among the permanently dispossessed is quite high. And so I can give you an example of that. So the American Armed Forces have been using IQ tests to screen for officers and enlisted men for a long time, more than 100 years. They're really good at it, and they know what they're doing. They've published a lot of the seminal research on IQ. And partly the reason they did that was because during wartime, you want to screen a lot of people really fast, and you want to find people who are generally competent, and you want to make them into officers, and you want to do that at an incredible rate because otherwise you lose. So like you're driven by absolute necessity, and that's why the military uses IQ tests, because there isn't a better way of screening people rapidly for competence than IQ tests. And so one of the upshots of that was that the armed forces has produced a lot of data on the relationship between IQ and your ability to function in the armed forces. And 20 years ago, something like that, they produced a policy that's now instantiated into American law that if you have an IQ of less than 83, you cannot be drafted into the armed forces. Why? Now, you think about this, because you've got to think about the conditions under which a scientific proposition might be valid. So if you discover a set of facts that you don't like, but you've discovered them and you're so convinced by their truth that you're willing to state the set of facts even though you don't like them, then that's one piece of evidence that they might be true, right? They run contrary to your bias rather than affirming it. Now, the armed forces wants every single person they can possibly get their hands on to be in the armed forces, right? Because they have a chronic shortage of people in wartime for obvious reasons, and they have a chronic shortage of people in peacetime. So it's a matter of American policy necessity first, to pull people into the armed forces, and then it's actually also a measure, especially in peacetime, of compassion and care for people to pull them into the armed forces. Because one of the things the armed forces have been used for in the United States is to pull people out of the underclass and to provide them with the means of social mobility that might put them up into the functional working class or above. And so that's an explicit part of policy. And so you actually want to pull as many people as you possibly can into that training ground. Nonetheless, they concluded that if you had an IQ of 83 or less, you can't be in the armed forces. And the reason for that was, despite years of effort, the people who make the selection decisions have determined that if you have an IQ of less than 83, you cannot be trained under any circumstances whatsoever to do anything in the armed forces that isn't positively counterproductive. That's 10% of the population. 10% of the population. And as our society becomes more technologically complex, which it is doing at a very, very rapid rate, the necessity for higher level cognitive function is increasing, not decreasing. And so, despite the fact that we have hierarchies, and despite the fact that we need them, and despite the fact that we have a very large number of hierarchies, we also have a situation where it's increasingly going to be the case that a narrow band of the population, 10%, it's not that narrow, is going to be permanently set outside those hierarchies. And that actually constitutes a real problem. Now, there's all sorts of other reasons you might get dispossessed, but that's a big one, man. And it's one that really does seem arbitrary, too, because, you might be a very smart person, and you might be happy about that, and you might be proud of it even, but it's actually not your fault. Like, you might have not done anything so idiotic that you made yourself permanently stupid. And congratulations for that. But, the IQ, to a very large degree, is biologically determined. And so if you happen to be in the upper 5th percentile, let's say, tremendous amount of that is cards you were dealt at birth. And, you might not like that idea. Environment can make you stupider, but it's very, very hard for it to make you smarter. So, and that's part of the reason people don't like the IQ literature, and no wonder. It's a harsh literature. But then, so there's the problem of people who aren't at the upper end or even in the middle of the cognitive distribution. There's a problem of people who are impaired in some manner. Their health is impaired physically or mentally. Plenty of people like that. There's all sorts of things that might put you outside the hierarchy, even though the hierarchy is necessary. And the reason that we need a left wing is to keep the criticism of the hierarchy out in the open, to make sure it doesn't degenerate into a power game, for example, and to speak on behalf of the genuinely dispossessed. And then the question is, well, how steep and purely functional should the hierarchy be? That's something you might promote if you're on the conservative end of things. And how flat and inclusive should it be to take care of the dispossessed? And that's something that you would push if you're on the left-wing part of the spectrum. And the answer is, we don't know, and it always changes, so we need to talk about it all the time. And so that's why we have political dialogue, right? Yeah, well, that's why free speech is so necessary. It's not just another right. You have to be a fool if you think that. If you're a political figure and you think that free speech is just another right, you have disqualified yourself from holding office because you don't understand how the system works at all. You say free speech is the mechanism by which the left and the right keep society in balance. You don't mess with that mechanism unless you want everything to become unbalanced. Okay, so now we've made a case for the left, right? So the left is in its proper place, it speaks for the dispossessed, and it's a critic of the proclivity for hierarchies to become blind and rigid. Okay, and what motivates the left? Well, we know some temperamental features that motivate people on the left. So people on the left tend to be more creative, they're more open, technically, that's a big 5 trait, and it's associated with the ability to think laterally. So if you're high in openness, if someone throws you an idea, you'll have a bunch of other ideas. And that's good because that's creative, but it's bad too because most of your ideas will be stupid and dangerous. Well, that's the price you pay for creativity, right? And you can even see that with creative people because creative people have a hard time catalyzing an identity because they can be so many things, it's hard for them to be anything at all. And so you see creative people who are often lost, especially if they're also high in negative emotion, because they can't organize themselves towards one thing, and they get scattered. And so, and creativity per se is necessary because there's hard problems and we haven't solved them and we need new solutions, but it's also deeply problematic because almost all new solutions are stupid and pathological. So creativity, like all other gifts, comes at a tremendous price. Anyways, the left-wingers tend to be more creative. They also tend to be less conscientious, especially orderly, which is part of conscientiousness. Conservatives tend to be more conscientious, and so they make good managers and administrators. They're really good at, once someone's figured out how to do something, conservatives are really good at doing it. But they're not so good at figuring out how to do a new thing. And so the way things look economically is that the liberal types generate new business ideas, most of which fail catastrophically, by the way, and some of which succeed immensely. And then conservatives leap in and run the new things and implement them insofar as they can be implemented algorithmically. And then they run them till their conclusion, the environment changes, the company dies because that solution no longer works, the company dies and a creative person comes up with a new idea. So another reason why the left and the right are necessary from a temperamental perspective is the liberal left types create new things, but the right conservative types run them. And so we need each other seriously. And so we have to have some appreciation across the temperamental and political divide. Okay, now the other thing that seems to motivate the left, at least to some degree, especially the more radical end of the left, is compassion. We've done some research that shows that agreeableness, which is the compassion dimension in the Big Five, predicts politically correct belief. And you can kind of understand compassion as a motivator, you know, like if you're walking down the street and you run across someone who's homeless, some young person, for example, a runaway, or even someone who's sort of in the throes of alcohol addiction, is laying on the street. It's not a pleasant experience. It's not like you take a moment to celebrate the oppressive hierarchy when you see somebody who's so obviously fallen out of the structure of the world. No one likes that. And if you're the more compassionate, if you're a conscientious conservative type, you might be somewhat judgmental in a situation like that, because conscientious people are less likely, for example, to give money to homeless people, partly because they judge them as well as feeling compassion towards them, whereas the compassionate, low conscientious types are instantly awash in mercy and pity. And there's something admirable about that, in the same way that watching a mother take care of an infant is admirable, right? Especially an infant who's under 6 months old, because the right response to an infant is compassion. So whatever an infant does before it's 6 months old is correct. Whenever it manifests any distress, your job is to drop whatever you're doing and fix it. Pure compassion. And that's so deeply wired into us, and appropriately so, that it's hard for us to even understand that a compassionate response isn't always the proper response in every circumstance. You know, and as your children grow, you start to temper compassion with judgment, right? And you increase the amount of judgment as they mature because you hold them accountable for their actions. And so compassion has to shade into something like judgment in order for development to proceed. You also see that on the social level. Compassion might be a perfectly good primary instinctive ethos for dealing with people who are truly, utterly dependent. But for setting up complex organizations like a business, well, there's no evidence whatsoever that agreeableness is a predictor of success. If you're an agreeable person, you get paid less and you don't do a better job. Exception there might be if you're caring directly for people. So in healthcare, customer service and that sort of thing, being agreeable might give you an edge. But mostly it's conscientiousness, which is a cold virtue. It's the ability to forego immediate gratification, for example, and to work dutifully and orderly towards a kind of a cold end. So compassion doesn't seem to scale, but nonetheless, it's necessary for people who are truly in trouble. And it has this feeling of moral virtue that's automatically associated with it. And I think that's part of the reason why, so here's the other issue, it's like the right wing can go too far. The right seems to go too far when it holds up a hierarchy as absolute, or when it starts to make claims of something like ethnic or racial superiority. You box the right wingers in, you say, no, you've gone too far. When does the left go too far? The answer is, well, we're not exactly sure, even though we know that the left can go too far, if we have any sense, because we read our 20th century history, and we understand that when the left went too far in the 20th century, it destroyed 100 million people. So the evidence is absolutely overwhelming that the left can go too far. But it's not so easy to figure out when. And that's actually a problem that's causing us an immense amount of trouble in our society at the moment. It's part of what's driving polarization, because we don't know how to box it in. And then the question I'm trying to address, at least in part, is, well, why not? Compassion is part of it. It's like compassion has the aspect of virtue about it. And it's especially true when people are genuinely dispossessed. Okay, and we don't know how to solve that problem. How much compassion is enough? Try making the rule, man. It's really difficult. Like, those of you who have children and are debating between you, mother and father, generally speaking, about how to discipline your children, well, that's always the discussion you're having. It's like, well, compassion or judgment here? And if you're the devouring mother type, technically speaking, it's all compassion. And if you're the harsh, tyrannical father, then it's all judgment. And both of those are wrong. Every decision is some balance between mercy and justice. And when you have children, you're doing that in real time. You're trying to figure out how to get that balance right, which is the same thing you have to do in a functioning political system, right? To get that balance right. So, okay, the compassion problem is a big problem. Here's another problem. The left tends to produce utopian vision, right? So for the communists, it was the eternal brotherhood of man, and everyone. It was an inclusive utopian vision, unlike the Nazi vision, which was for us and not for you. And so that kind of made it suspect right from the beginning, especially if you weren't included in the us, right? So, but the communists, they came out with this universal vision of brotherhood and the promise of a better future. And the thing is, that's attractive. And it's attractive even psychologically, because one of the things that you are working towards is a better future, right? I mean, you go out there and you do something, and the reason you do it is because you think things will be better if you do it. And so you're always moved ahead by the promise of the dawning utopia, in a sense. You're always trying to improve your life. And you say, well, of course you're trying to improve your life. It's sort of like built into the definition of improve. And so it's really easy to hook you with a utopian vision because it fits right into your psychology. And it's also not easy to say what's wrong with it. It's like, well, what's wrong with the utopian vision of eternal brotherhood? Isn't that what we want? It's like the answer is, well, yeah, kind of. But another answer is the devil's in the details. Okay, so that's another reason why it's hard to box in the left when it goes too far, because they offer this universalist utopian vision that hooks into our psychology. I was talking to some very smart people in London 2 or 3 days ago, and we were talking about the utopian vision, and one of the people there, who was a professor at Cambridge, if I remember correctly, said something really interesting about the utopia. He said, well, what's the danger of a utopian vision? We've already outlined what might be good about it. Well, you'll make sacrifices to bring about something better. Right? Everyone does that in your life. You sacrifice the pleasures of today for the accomplishments of tomorrow. It's sort of the definition of being disciplined, right? And you might say, well, the better the outcome, the more justified the sacrifice. So, well, that's the problem with the utopian vision of perfection. He was talking about this UK historian, I think his name was Hobsbawm, famous left-wing historian, who was asked a few years ago, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the full revelation of the absolute catastrophes of the radical left in the 20th century. He was asked about his commitment to the socialist utopian ideal, the communist utopian ideal. And he was asked something like, well, if we could bring about that utopia, would have all those sacrifices been worthwhile? And his answer was yes. So, well, if the goal is sufficiently elevated, then any sacrifice is worthwhile. And you can kind of understand that, because you're willing to make sacrifices of extreme sort for the health and happiness, continued happiness of your family. So where does that go wrong? Well, maybe it goes wrong when you put the cart before the horse. You see, I thought about Hitler a lot, and the way Hitler ended his life, right? Berlin was in flames, Europe was in ruins, the world was torn apart, tens of millions of people had died, and he put a bullet through his head, angry and despondent about the betrayal of his Germanic people, because that's how Hitler viewed the end of the war. He didn't think he'd failed. He thought the Germans didn't live up to his damn vision. And when we look at someone like Hitler and his hopes for world domination, we naively assume that he was hoping for world domination. But he was a bad guy. And so it's not necessarily the case that he was aiming for what he said he was aiming for, or that he was aiming for what he was selling, as pathological as it might have been. Maybe he was aiming to put a bullet through his head in a bunker in Berlin with the city in flames and Europe in ruins and tens of millions of people dead around him. That seems to be far more accurate to me. And so we could say the same thing about the utopian radical leftists. It's like, well, hypothetically, they were going to bring in the beatific vision and the dawn of the new utopia. A lot of things had to be sacrificed along the way, and most of those happened to be other people. And so then we might just reverse that and say, wait a sec, maybe there's a dark part of each of us, including the utopians, who would actually like to sacrifice as many people as possible in the shortest possible order with the most possible brutality. And they're actually looking for a way to make that saleable to the general population, or maybe even to themselves. Because who the hell wants to look in the mirror and decide that you're a tyrannical, murderous monster? You want to at least think you're motivated by the highest possible motives. Well, what's the highest possible motive? Well, the beatific vision, the heavenly utopia, the brotherhood of man that justifies every murder and is perhaps created not to bring about that utopia, but to justify the damn murders. And that's another thing that we should be very careful about when we lay out our utopian visions, because we're forgetting that we each have a very dark part. and that dark part has a say in how we construe our fantasies and what motivates us in the world. So that's a secondary danger of the universalist vision of the left. I was thinking about this tonight just before I came out here, and I was thinking about this issue of sacrifice. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in 12 Rules for Life is return two things. I'm trying to make a case that the Judeo-Christian platform on which our conscious political structure is predicated cannot be eradicated without terrible consequences. Now, I know why it's shaky and all of that, and that's partly what I was talking to Sam Harris about in great detail. But I don't believe that we can take what we have and tear the story out from underneath it without leaving a void that will be filled by all sorts of pathological things. Now, maybe we can't return to the past. We never can, really. And so it's a problem that's very difficult to solve. But here I'll tell you something about that story that's really interesting. You know, we already pointed out that you need a vision to kind of move you through life, right? You got to have a sense that you're moving towards something better, and the better that better is, the more you might be motivated to pursue it. And so that would have a tendency to transform itself archetypally into something like the kingdom of God, or heaven on earth, or the eternal brotherhood of man, some ultimate ideal. And you can't just scrap the ultimate ideal, not so easily. But then you have the problem with the ultimate ideal demands sacrifice. And then you have the problem, I'm writing the preface to the Gulag Archipelago, the abridged version, the 50th anniversary version. And I have to deliver that in the next couple of days, and that's partly why I've been working through the problems that I'm sharing with you tonight. It's like, certainly the Russian revolutionaries were willing to sacrifice everyone to their heavenly vision, and that started right away as soon as the revolution occurred. It didn't take 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. It wasn't dependent on the cult of personality. The rounding up and the sacrifices, they were happening right now and on a huge scale. And so it's a tremendous danger. You have to make sacrifices to attain the vision. Who should you sacrifice? Well, you know, one of the things that's really interesting about the narrative substructure upon which our culture is predicated is that the answer to that question is provided in those stories. It's provided, at least in part, by the image of the crucifixion, right? Because that's a self-sacrifice. You have to sacrifice something to attain what's necessary. If it isn't going to be you who sacrifices yourself, then it's going to be you who sacrifices someone else. That's what it looks like. The sacrifice might be necessary. Well, and we know sacrifice is necessary, right? There's the archaic idea of sacrifice. You offer something up to God in the hopes that his benevolence will shine on you. And you can think about that as a kind of superstition. And in a sense it is, to sacrifice an animal, to burn it so that its smoke arises to heaven, so God can detect the quality of your sacrifice and determine whether you're living in accordance with a heavenly, what would you call it? With a heavenly ethic. But it's acted out. It's a very sophisticated idea that's acted out first. We all know we have to make sacrifices. When I ask my students, what did your parents sacrifice so you could go to university? Most of them, children of first-generation immigrants as they are, can list off a very long list of sacrifices that their parents made. And we know that a hallmark of maturity is to make sacrifice for something that's better in the future. What should you sacrifice? How about not other people? You have to sacrifice something, though. Well, if you're not going to sacrifice other people, well, then you offer yourself up as a voluntary sacrifice, right? And that's part of that underlying story. And that's part of the antidote to the pathology of compassion, let's say, that's part of the ethos of the radical collectivist left. The antidote to that collective version of sacrifice is, as far as I'm concerned, the fundamental notion of individual sacrifice. And what that means is the adoption of individual responsibility. And what's so remarkable about that, I think, is that the story upon which our culture, our functional culture, is predicated is the story that places the fundamental burden for putting the structure of reality right on you as a consequence of the necessity for you to make the proper sacrifices voluntarily. And I think that that story is true, and that we need to understand it. because we act it out imperfectly, and we deviate from it at our peril, and we need to wake up, and we need to become conscious of exactly what it means. Thank you very much.